to mutual permeability and binding. Because what we vaguely call the ground is not in truth a coherent surface at all, but a zone in which the air and moisture of the sky combine with substances whose source lies in the earth, in the ongoing formation of living things. Of a seed that has fallen to the ground, Paul Clay writes that the relation to earth and atmosphere begets the capacity to grow. The seed strikes root. Initially, the line is directed earthwards, though not to dwell there, only to draw energy thence for reaching up into the air. And he accompanies this comment with, as he always does, with a picture. There's his Paul Clays from his notebooks, a picture of, in fact, the point becoming a line, the seed taking root and growing. First goes down and then reaches up. So in growth, the point becomes a line, but the line, far from being mounted upon a pre-prepared surface of the ground, contributes to its ever-evolving weave. There could be no life, in short, in a world where earth and sky don't mix and mingle. And for an impression of what it means to inhabit such an earth-sky world, we can return to Heidegger. I've just got some, doesn't matter if you can't read this, but I'll put it up anyway, just so you get it. In an admittedly florid passage, Heidegger describes the earth as the serving bearer, blossoming and fruiting, spreading out in rock and water, rising up into plant and animal. And of the sky he writes that it is the vaulting path of the sun, the course of the changing moon, the wandering glitter of the stars, the years, seasons and their changes, the light and dusk of the day, the gloom and glow of the night, the clemency and inclemency of the weather, the drifting clouds and blue depth of the ether. Moreover, one cannot speak of the earth, says Heidegger, without already thinking of the sky, and vice versa. Each partakes of the essence of the other. And how different this is from Gibson's account of the earth and sky as mutually exclusive domains rigidly held apart at the ground surface and populated with their respective objects. So, says Gibson, the environment consists of the earth and the sky with objects on the earth and in the sky, of mountains and clouds, fires and sunsets, pebbles and stars. And it's fun to think about how many of those could possibly be objects. I mean, is the sunset, for example, an object in a very odd way? So in place of Gibson's nouns denoting items of furniture, Heidegger's description is replete with verbs of growth and motion. In the earth's rising up, as Heidegger puts it, in the irrepressible discharge of substance through the porous surfaces of emergent forms, we find the essence of life. Things are alive, as I've noted already, because they leak. Life in the EWO will not be contained, but rather inheres in the very circulations of materials that continually give rise to the forms of things, even as they threaten their dissolution. So it's through their immersion in these circulations that things are brought to life. And you can demonstrate this by means of a simple experiment, which I've carried out with my students at the University of Aberdeen. Using a square of paper, light bamboo struts, ribbon, tape, glue, and twine, it's easy and quick to make a kite. We did this indoors, working on tables. 20 students each made a kite for themselves. And it seemed, to all intents and purposes, as we were working indoors with these bits and pieces, that we were assembling an object. But when we carried our creations to a field outside, everything changed. They suddenly leapt into action, twirling, spinning, nose-diving, and just occasionally flying. So what had happened? Had some animating force magically jumped into the kites, causing them to act, most often in ways we didn't intend? Of course not. It was rather that the kites were now immersed in the currents of wind. The kite that had laid lifeless on the table indoors had become a kite in the air. It was no longer an object, but a thing. And as the thing exists in its thinking, so the kite in the air exists in its flying. Or to put it another way, at the moment it was taken out of doors, the kite ceased to be an object that can be set in motion and became instead a movement that resolves itself into the form of a thing. One could say the same, indeed, of the bird in the air or the fish in the water. The bird is its flying, the fish is its swimming. The bird can fly thanks to the currents and vortices that it sets up in the air, and the fish can swim at speed because of eddies and vortices set up through the swishing of its tail and fins. Cut out from these currents, fish and bird would be dead. So this is the point at which we can tackle, and I hope, though I know it won't happen, bury once and for all the so-called problem of agency. Much has been written on the relations between people and objects, guided by the thought that the difference between them is far from absolute. If persons can act on objects in their vicinity, so, it's argued, objects can act back, causing persons to do or allowing them to achieve what they otherwise could not. Yet in the very first theoretical move that sets things aside in order to focus on their objectness, they are cut off from the flows that bring them to life. And we saw that with the kite. To think of the kite as an object is to omit the wind, to forget that it is in the first place a kite in the air. And so it seems that the kite's flying is the result of an interaction between a person, the flyer, and an object, the kite, which can only be explained by imagining that the kite is somehow endowed with some internal animating principle, an agency that sets it in motion, most often contrary to the will of the flyer. More generally, I suggest that the problem of agency is born of the attempt to reanimate a world of things already deadened and reduced to inertia by arresting the flows of substance, of materials that give them life. In the EWO, the environment without objects, things move and grow because they are alive, not because they have agency. And they are alive precisely because they have not been reduced to the status of objects. I have to confess that I recoil with irritation every time I see the life of things rendered as the agency of objects. What is the source of this double reduction of things to objects and of life to agency? It is, I believe, none other than the hylomorphic model. When analysts speak of the material world, or even more abstractly, of materiality, what do they mean? What sense does it make to invoke the materiality of trees, stones, clouds, buildings, or even kites? Put the question to students of material culture and you're likely to get contradictory answers. Thus, a stone, according to Chris Tilley, can be regarded in its brute materiality simply as a formless lump of matter. Yet, he says, we need a concept of materiality in order to understand how particular pieces of stone are given form and meaning within specific social and historical contexts. Likewise, archaeologist Joshua Pollard explains that by materiality, I mean how the material character of the world is comprehended, appropriated, and involved in human projects. Now, we can recognize in both pronouncements the two sides of the hylomorphic model. On the one side, brute materiality, or the world's material character. On the other, the form-bestowing agency of human beings. In the concept of materiality, the division between matter and form is reproduced rather than challenged. Indeed, the very concept of material culture is a modern-day expression of the matter form of hylomorphism. When Tilley writes of brute materiality, or archaeologist Bjørnar Olsen of the hard physicality of the world, It's as if the